Suppose you were to go for a walk in Boston on a pleasant summer day. And suppose you turned a corner and saw in the distance a crowd of people in the act of hanging what appeared to be a man from a large elm tree. You would probably be horrified. If you were smart, you'd get as far away as possible. And surely you would be no less horrified if you had been in Boston when this really did happen, on August 14th, 1765, at the corner of Essex and Orange Street. Although, if you had been brave enough to get closer, you might actually be relieved to find that it wasn't a man at all that was being hung, but an effigy. But really, this is only a little less horrifying, right? To pretend to kill someone is still a serious thing, especially if it's symbolic. An effigy is a message that someone deserves to be hung, or that a group of people is willing to hang someone and really will hang them if their demands are not met. But who could so inspire the wrath of the colonists to want to go through the motions of this mock execution? Rumors circulated in Boston and at dinner parties. John Adams noted in his diary that, dining one night at the Boylstones, a Mr. Hallowell claims that he saw Samuel Adams under the Tree of Liberty when the effigies hung there, and asked him who they were and what. He said he did not know. He could not tell. He wanted to inquire. The truth is that it was an effigy of Andrew Oliver, and his only crime was that he was the man appointed to distribute stamps and collect the stamp tax. However, after this fateful day, when the effigy was hung and later taken down, beheaded, and burned on a bonfire made of Oliver's own furniture, Oliver understandably resigned his commission as stamp distributor. This was a truly historic day, because it was the very first act of colonial defiance against the British government. But it was neither the only act of defiance, nor the most important. In Virginia, not only would an effigy be burned in Williamsburg as well, but the colonial legislative body, called the House of Burgesses, led by the charisma and clever political maneuvering of Patrick Henry, would declare the British tax to be illegal. When some of the shocked Virginia representatives suggested that this was treasonous, Henry responded, "If this be treason, make the most of it." Other colonial governments would resist the Stamp Act more moderately, but they all unanimously opposed this new British law. And it's at this point that we might ask, how did we get here? Why was this Stamp Act such a big deal? Why did it, of all things, lead to the first American acts of resistance against the British? Zooming out with the benefit of hindsight, we can see that this one act, more than anything else, would spark a decade of discontents, riots, and unrest that would eventually lead to July 4th, 1776. This crack would become an ever-widening fissure that eventually would forever separate America and Great Britain. Who could have thought that a single law would have undone so many? Indeed, for many of us, this response, this outrage, seems confusing. While all of us are no doubt frustrated by paying taxes, very frustrated, especially paying taxes that we feel we don't have a say in, or that we don't get a service from in return, we don't take to the streets like this over taxes. Were these just different people living in a different time? That might be part of it. But while it might be intimidating to realize that people of the past are very much like us, the reality is that if we were in their shoes, we would do much the same thing. The problem is that it's difficult, in general, to see through the fog of history and to truly understand the past. In particular, it's difficult to realize how destructive and tyrannical the Stamp Act really was, or would have been, if the colonists hadn't resisted and effected its repeal. What's startling is that even at the time, the British Parliament didn't realize how destructive these laws were either, even as they passed them. In response to the Stamp Act, John Adams wrote a dissertation on canon and feudal law, the first line of which reads, "Ignorance and inconsideration are the two great causes of the ruin of mankind." We might hear in this, partly, a shot at Parliament. Too often the state is ignorant of the effect its laws will have. Too often legislators fail to consider the wider ramifications of their laws. Because of this, we would do well to take this as a warning for our own time. We should consider the laws of the past and their effects so that we can better understand the laws of the present and how they might ruin us. If we fail to accurately appraise something so momentous and yet confusing as the Stamp Act, it may be to the undoing of everyday people, as it might have been in the colonies. For the American colonists, this one tax was more than just an added expense. It was a restriction on free speech, an economic restructuring of society, and a political restructuring of power. In a word, it was seen as a tool to completely restructure colonial society from the top down, all in one little law, a magician's sleight of hand, in which an innocent tax cloaked the effective means to change the lives of the colonists forever. Whether this attempted restructuring was truly intentional, or a simple matter of ignorance on the part of the British government, it's difficult to say, and it would depend on who you could ask if you could go back in time. Ostensibly, the Stamp Act was simply a duty for collecting taxes that would help the British Treasury recover from the 7 Years' War, a proto-World War that had spanned Europe and North America, plunging the British Treasury deeply into debt. The British had fought the French on American soil, defending the colonies with the greatest military in the world, and finally gaining dominance of North America, which meant the colonists would no longer have to worry about intermittent conflicts with allied French and Native American forces. And many in the British government thought, why not tax the colonies to help relieve the empire's debt? If we could go back in time and ask Paymaster General Charles Townshend about the tax, he would no doubt say that the Stamp Act was, for the British Treasury, a cheap way of collecting money, and simply a matter of the colonists doing their part for the collective. After all, why shouldn't the Americans pay their fair share? And now will these Americans, children planted by our care, nourished by our indulgence until they are grown to a degree of strength and opulence and protected by our arms, will they grudge to contribute their might to relieve us from the heavy weight of the burden we lie under? Makes sense, right? There's just one problem. Not only had the colonies already expended exorbitant amounts of money during the 7 Years' War, a fact that Parliament evidently was unaware of, but the greater problem is that, before this point, Parliament had never taxed the colonies. While imports and exports had been taxed by the laying of duties, never before had Parliament laid an internal tax upon the colonies. When we look back at something through the murky fogs of history, it can be easy to forget that the colonies were founded as settlements independent from the British government. The original settlers of America had crossed the ocean and set up homes, towns, and governments independently, by their own efforts and often at their own expense. There had been an understanding that the colonists, while gladly remaining British subjects, loyal to the crown, would be essentially self-governing entities. This very point was made again and again, not just by the colonists, but even by members of Parliament. One such member of Parliament, Isaac Barré, the man who actually coined the term Sons of Liberty in reference to the Americans, pointed out that the colonies were established by people fleeing from English tyranny in the first place, fleeing from the British government, and therefore the colonies were de facto created to be outside of Parliament's authority. They, planted by your care? No, your oppression planted them in America. They fled from your tyranny to a then uncultivated and unhospitable country where they exposed themselves to almost all the hardships to which human nature is liable, and among others to the cruelties of a savage foe, the most subtle, and I take upon me to say the most formidable of any people upon the face of God's earth. They, nourished by your indulgence, they grew by your neglect of them. As soon as you began to care about them, that care was exercised in sending persons to rule over them, in one department and another, who were perhaps the deputies of deputies to some member of this house, sent to spy out their liberty, to misrepresent their actions and to prey upon them. Men whose behavior on many occasions has caused the blood of those sons of liberty to recoil within them. Now, both of these narratives are perhaps exaggerated in their own ways, falling on opposite extremes of the truth. And while there was a lot of disagreement and confusion over what the relationship between the colonies and Great Britain had been in the past and what it should be going into the future, the fact is that, whether it was justified or not, Parliament was trying to control the colonies in ways it had never done before, and in ways that would cause catastrophic damage to the American colonies. In a modern age when many people are talking about censorship on social media platforms, we have to remember that in the 18th century, the primary way of communicating, speaking, disseminating information, and conducting business, outside of speaking face-to-face, was with paper, specifically printed paper. The Stamp Act, as a tax on printed materials, affected just about every form of printed public communication and business transaction. The act required all printed material to have a specific stamp on it. Basically, you would have to purchase the stamp from a commissioned distributor and then place it on anything that was printed. This applied to wills, deeds, newspapers, pamphlets, and even playing cards. The tax meant that printers who could not afford stamps would go out of business. Those that stayed in business would have to raise the price of printed materials, affecting on the one hand who could speak to the public through writing, and who could gain access to things like books, newspapers, and legal documents. The tax would affect how all business was conducted, but it was most expensive for lawyers and college students, which affected colonial legal functioning and suppressed and restricted who could receive an education and obtain professional status. The stamps could only be purchased by hard money, which was rare in the colonies as opposed to the more plentiful paper money. And this only further limited who had the ability to communicate publicly and disseminate and consume information. All of these factors led the lawyer and farmer John Adams to claim, "It seems very manifest from the Stamp Act itself that a design is formed to strip us in a great measure of the means of knowledge, by loading the press, the colleges, and even an almanac and a newspaper with restraints and duties, and to introduce the inequalities and dependencies of the feudal system, by taking from the poorer sort of people all their little subsistence and conferring it on a set of stamp officers, distributors, and their deputies." In other words, Adams was concerned that the Stamp Act was a means of effecting what one might call a great reset in his day, in which the entire system of the colonies was reorganized, from the colleges to professions to lawyers and courts, and reduced to greater dependence on Great Britain, and therefore more subject to the predation and whims of British government. In his dissertation on canon and feudal law, Adams articulated a theory in which he says that liberty is directly connected to knowledge. Where there is greater knowledge, where people are more educated and informed, there is greater liberty. Conversely, when the sources of knowledge are stopped up, people not only become less free, but they become more docile and slavish, doing what they are told and obeying people who try to control them. We remember that Adams began by saying that ignorance and lack of consideration are the two great causes of the ruin of mankind. And he goes on to explain that man certainly has an exalted soul, and that same principle in humane nature, that aspiring, noble principle, founded in benevolence and cherished by knowledge, I mean the love of power, which has been so often the cause of slavery, has, whenever freedom has existed, been the cause of freedom. In other words, Adams is saying that there is a principle in human beings, which we might call the love of power, or the will to power, which has caused people in authority to desire power over others, and to control others. As he wrote further down, the jaws of power are always opened to devour, and her arm is always stretched out, if possible, to destroy the freedom of thinking, speaking, and writing. But it is this same principle, this same love of power, that has also led to freedom, has always stimulated the common people to aspire at independency and to endeavor at confining the power of the great within the limits of equity and reason, so long as it is founded in benevolence and cherished by knowledge. Knowledge is the protein to the muscle of liberty. So not only is knowledge necessary for liberty, but liberty is a natural, inevitable result of people being truly educated. In systems where there is a high flow of not just information, but knowledge, there is a greater degree of liberty. There's a freer range of motion, greater ability, and greater strength. And this is why, according to Adams, the early settlers of America founded colleges and required every town of a certain population to have a grammar school. They were convinced, by their knowledge of human nature derived from history and their own experience, that nothing could preserve their posterity from the encroachments of the two systems of tyranny, but knowledge diffused generally through the whole body of the people. And because of this emphasis on education, Adams claims that the colonial Americans were some of the best educated people in the world. It has been observed that we are, all of us, lawyers, divines, politicians, and philosophers. And I have good authorities to say that all candid foreigners who have passed through this country and conversed freely with all sorts of people here will allow that they have never seen so much knowledge and civility among the common people in any part of the world. And this opinion would be echoed independently by Alexis de Tocqueville nearly a century later, when traveling among the settlers of what is now Michigan. While Tocqueville painted a picture of the frontiers which was not altogether rosy, he did remark with surprise that those territories which have been populated for the longest time and to the greatest extent have reached the highest degree of civilization. Their schooling has been lavishly extensive, and the spirit of equality and republicanism has spread an exceptionally uniform coloring over the personal habits of life. The average settler would invite you into his one-room cabin and draw on a piece of paper a plan of campaign for the Belgians, and will tell you seriously what further steps must be taken for France to be prosperous. You would believe him to be a wealthy landowner who has briefly come to take up residence for a few days hunting. And this, by the way, is an important difference between knowledge and information. To be informed is generally to be aware, but to have knowledge is to be able to make practical application, to effect change, make judgments, theorize, and implement. It means knowing the geography of Belgium and knowing the principles of war thoroughly enough to apply them and draw campaign plans. It means knowing the principles of economics enough to develop a step-by-step plan for a foreign country's prosperity. Both information and knowledge are crucial for liberty, though we are frighteningly lacking in the latter today. Adams continues by saying, "And liberty cannot be preserved without a general knowledge among the people, who have a right from the frame of their nature to knowledge, as their Creator, who does nothing in vain, has given them understandings and a desire to know. But besides this, they have a right, an indisputable, unalienable, indefeasible, divine right to that most dreaded and envied kind of knowledge. I mean the characters and conduct of their rulers. As a fundamental human right, it is the duty of the government not merely to allow free speech, but to preserve the means of knowledge, neither interfering to stop the flow of knowledge, nor allowing private individuals or corporations to hinder access to and dissemination of knowledge. The preservation of the means of knowledge among the lowest ranks is of more importance to the public than all the property of all the rich men in the country, and none of the means of information are more sacred or have been cherished with more tenderness and care by the settlers of America than the press. Care has been taken that the art of printing should be encouraged, and that it should be easy and cheap and safe for any person to communicate his thoughts to the public. In stressing the absolute necessity of the freedom of the press, Adams was by no means original, but was merely shooting forth as yet another branch on the tall tree of free speech. And this, it is worth noting, is just as important, if not more so, than trying to say something new or revolutionary. It is better to always be repeating old things, to be leaves on these great trees which were planted long before we were born. Better to nourish them by gathering in sunlight and sending out oxygen than always to be planting new seeds, should we ever allow them to die or succumb to the axe. 100 years before Adams, John Milton in his own day had opposed censorship of a different sort. In June of 1643, Parliament had issued an ordinance for licensing the press to, quote, regulate printing, that no book, pamphlet, or paper shall be henceforth printed unless the same be first approved and licensed by such, or at least one of such, as shall be thereto appointed. Unlicensed books were literally illegal. In response, the literary giant John Milton wrote what would become one of the most important and influential works on what we today call freedom of speech, a prose polemic called Areopagitica. Milton begins the work with lines from Euripides, thus tracing the roots of free speech back thousands of years before modernity to ancient Greece. indicating that free speech is neither a modern nor a peculiarly Enlightenment value. This is true liberty, when free-born men, having to advise the public, may speak free, which he who can and will deserves high praise, who neither can nor will may hold his peace. What can be juster in a state than this? Indeed, says Milton, no one can hope for a kind of society where no one wrongs another person, or where there is no injustice at all. Nor can we hope for the kind of liberty where no grievance arises. However, when complaints are freely heard, deeply considered, and speedily reformed, then is the utmost bound of civil liberty attained that wise men look for. Milton realized that communication was a fundamental root which fed liberty and empowered individuals, and he believed that a firm system of free speech was the one thing that was lacking in the Roman Republic, which allowed the Roman people to succumb first to the tyranny of the worst Roman emperors, and later to the popes. Without free speech, the great tool for resisting tyranny, no amount of bravery or courage can vanquish tyranny. Truth and understanding are not such wares as to be monopolized and traded in by tickets and statutes and standards. We must not think to make a staple commodity of all the knowledge in our land, to mark and license it like our broadcloth and our wool packs. What is it but a servitude, like that imposed by the Philistines, not to be allowed the sharpening of our own axes and coulters, but we must repair from all quarters to 20 licensing forges. The equation of speech with tools that are necessary for life, but which might be made deadly weapons used for insurrection or even self-defense, is a poignant comparison, and relevant today. Milton's biblically literate audience would have understood the allusion to a conquered people held in subjection. People who are not allowed to speak freely are a conquered people. Knowledge and words are dangerous indeed, not least of all to tyrants. The kind of liberalism that would not allow people to own dangerous things, or to do things that might be dangerous to those who are not fortified for their own defense, that is the very liberalism that has no defense against tyranny or the peaceful voting away of liberty. We can hear John Adams echoing Milton when Milton argues that it is censorship and the deprivation of the means of knowledge, like deprivation of nutrient food, that makes people docile and all too happy to conform to all forms of tyranny and any law imposed upon them. These are the fruits which a dull ease and cessation of our knowledge will bring forth among the people. Ignorance produces obedient conformity and freezes people together into a monolithic collective like a January freeze. The more ignorant people are, the more willing they are to comply with what they are told. Therefore, of all the liberties that man has a right to, Milton places freedom of speech in the first rank. Give me the liberty to know, to utter, and to argue freely according to conscience, above all liberties. And of all the liberties we cry out for today, how rarely do we assert the right to know and exercise ourselves in learning? And how seldom do we demand from our leaders the right to know their characters, which, says Adams, is a right from God. By the 1720s, free speech was a common enough idea, and though its roots sink deep into human nature, its roots had not yet sunk deep into law. Even in America, printers could be imprisoned for speaking against the colonial governments, a fate which happened several times to one printer named James Franklin. On one such occasion, as he was tossed into jail, his younger brother, named Benjamin, was forced to take over managing the printing at the shop. The 16-year-old Benjamin Franklin, under his pseudonym Silence Dogood, promptly reprinted an article from the London Journal on the importance of freedom of the press. Without freedom of thought, there can be no such thing as wisdom, and no such thing as public liberty without freedom of speech, which is the right of every man, as far as by it he does not hurt or control the right of another. And this is the only check it ought to suffer, and the only bounds it ought to know. This sacred privilege is so essential to free governments that the security of property and the freedom of speech always go together. And in those wretched countries where a man cannot call his tongue his own, he can scarce call anything else his own. Whoever would overthrow the liberty of a nation must begin by subduing the freeness of speech, a thing terrible to public traitors. A free people will be showing that they are so by their freedom of speech. So it's not just that based on our nature and constitution as creatures that we should have the right to speak freely, lest our human nature be abrogated, and that's important. But beyond that, if we do not have the freedom to speak as we please, no other area of society can long remain free. Free speech is the sluice from which all liberty flows. To make a people more controllable, one needs only to silence free speech and limit the means of knowledge. By 1765, it was not necessary to throw printers into jail to silence the presses. Printers could be stopped with a tax, and knowledge could be suppressed by economics rather than with licenses and laws. And according to John Adams, this is exactly what the Stamp Act was designed to do. It was an attempt by Parliament to control the colonies by keeping them blind, like blinders on a horse or an alligator with its eyes covered. The less knowledge they had, the more obedient and docile they could be, and the more the British Treasury could be enriched. Parliament was trying to bring these independently formed colonies more and more under British law and dominion. While all of this might seem like paranoid colonial conspiracy theories, Adams's suspicions were corroborated independently by Benjamin Franklin, who by the time of the Stamp Act controversy was not in America, but in London, having arrived there the previous year in 1764 on behalf of the Pennsylvania Assembly on business unrelated to this video. When the chaos of the Stamp Act broke out, Franklin opposed the act as being unconstitutional and took it upon himself to do everything in his power to repeal it. He met with the Lord Treasurer George Grenville, who was the architect of the act, to try and persuade him against it, but to no avail. Franklin wrote, "The nation was provoked by American claims of independence, and all parties joined in resolving by this act to settle the point. We might as well have hindered the sun's setting. That we could not do. But since 'tis down, my friend, and it may be long before it rises again, let us make as good a night of it as we can. We may still light candles. Frugality and industry will go a great way towards indemnifying us. Idleness and pride tax with a heavier hand than kings and parliaments. If we can get rid of the former, we may easily bear the latter." And this latter attitude, which seemed complacent in the face of rising tyranny, only earned Franklin scorn in the colonies. Franklin was famously moderate, temperate, and tactfully restrained in dealing with political matters. Franklin encouraged the colonies to seek peaceful political solutions while remaining loyal to Great Britain. writing to his friend and Pennsylvania stamp distributor John Hughes, he said, "But the rashness of the Assembly in Virginia is amazing. I hope, however, that ours will keep within the bounds of prudence and moderation, for that is the only way to lighten or get clear of our burthens. As to the Stamp Act, though, we purpose doing our endeavor to get it repealed, in which I am sure you would concur with us. Yet, the success is uncertain. If it continues, our undertaking to execute it may make you unpopular for a time, but your acting with coolness and steadiness, and with every circumstance in your power of favor to the people, will by degrees reconcile them. In the meantime, a firm loyalty to the Crown and faithful adherence to the government of this nation, which it is the safety as well as the honor of the colonies to be connected with, will always be the wisest course for you and I to take, whatever may be the madness of the populace or their blind leaders, who can only bring themselves and country into trouble and draw on greater burthens by acts of rebellious tendency." While Franklin hoped that by doing everything to support the colonists, coolness and steadiness would reconcile them, in reality, rather than being pacified, the colonists threatened to destroy his house, as well as the house of John Hughes. Evidently, a mob of colonists were celebrating the end of Grenville's term as Lord Treasurer and the entry into office of Lord Rockingham, a man more sympathetic to the colonial cause. And what better way to celebrate than by burning down Ben Franklin's house? Franklin's wife Deborah, still in their house at Pennsylvania, refused to flee, and instead armed herself with, apparently, the help of a friend and her brother, though, I will admit, her letter is a bit difficult to decipher. "You will see by the papers what work has happened in other places, and something has been said relating to raising a mob in this place. I was for 9 days keep in one continued hurry by Pepple to remove us, and Sally was persuaded to go to Burlington for safety. But on Monday last, we had very great rejoicing on account of the change of the ministry and a preparation for bonfires at night, and several houses threatened to be pulled down. Cousin Davenport come and told me that more than 20 people had told him it was his duty to be with me. I said I was pleased to receive civility from anybody, so he stayed with me some time towards night. I said he should fetch a gun or two, as we had none. I sent to ask my brother to come and bring his gun also. We made one room into a magazine. I ordered some sort of defense upstairs so I could manage myself. I said when I was advised to remove that I was very sure you had done nothing to hurt anybody, nor had I not given any offense to any person at all, nor would I be made uneasy by anybody, nor would I stir or show the least uneasiness. But if anyone came to disturb me, I would show a proper resentment, and I should be very affronted with anybody. I was told that there was 800 men ready to assist anyone that should be molested. Yeah, let's just say Deborah Franklin was not exactly an Abigail Adams. At any rate, thanks to being armed and having a surly attitude, and with the help of a group of 800 Franklin supporters, the mob was dissuaded from doing to Franklin's house what had been done to Andrew Oliver's home in Boston. It's good to have friends in both high and low places. Not everyone was against Franklin, and only a minority were truly violent. But nevertheless, this incident of mob violence is indicative of the shellacking which Franklin took from public opinion and the kind of criticism in the press which incited such animosity toward him in the colonies. But this undeserved criticism didn't faze him. He wrote, "I have often met with such treatment from people that I was all the while endeavoring to serve. These are the operations of nature. It sometimes is cloudy, it rains, it hails. Again, 'tis clear and pleasant, and the sun shines on us. Take one thing with another, and the world is a pretty good sort of world. And 'tis our duty to make the best of it and be thankful. One's true happiness depends more upon one's own judgment of oneself, on a consciousness of rectitude in action and intention, and in the approbation of those few who judge impartially, than upon the applause of the unthinking, undiscerning multitude, who are apt to cry Hosanna today, and tomorrow crucify him." I'm reminded of Chesterton's paradox that optimists are always better reformers than pessimists. The man who believes life to be excellent is the man who alters it most. It seems a paradox, yet the reason of it is very plain. The pessimist can be enraged at evil, but only the optimist can be surprised at it. From the reformer is required a simplicity of surprise. He must have the faculty of a violent and virgin astonishment. It is not enough that he should think injustice distressing. He must think injustice absurd, an anomaly in existence, a matter less for tears than for a shattering laughter. This will be important for us in later videos when we consider the repair of liberty. For now, as we consider how to repeal terrible tyrannical laws, we can learn a lot from Franklin, who, despite being torn apart by critics in the colonies, continued trying to get the Stamp Act repealed, grounded in a firm conviction that the Americans should remain loyal to the Crown, but that Parliament should have no control over the colonies. Franklin continued making efforts against the Stamp Act. In doing so, he became kind of the unofficial ambassador on behalf of not just Pennsylvania, but of all the American colonies. And eventually, it was ultimately thanks to him, more than any single person, that the Stamp Act was repealed. But that's not to say that Franklin acted alone. You see, it all began when many merchants in America, realizing that a significant portion of British industry and commerce was dependent on the colonial market, organized a movement to stop importation of British goods. And this movement spread throughout the colonies. In Massachusetts, John Adams did his part both professionally and non-professionally. Professionally, he instructed the representatives from Braintree, Massachusetts, to comply with no measures or proposals for countenancing the Stamp Act or assisting in the execution of it by all lawful means consistent with our allegiance to the King and relation to Great Britain, to oppose the execution of it till we hear the success of the cries and petitions of America for relief. In the press, under the pseudonym of Humphrey Plowjogger, Adams comically urged his fellow colonists to boycott British goods. "I do say I won't buy 1 shilling worth of anything that comes from Old England till the Stamp Act is appealed, nor I won't let any of my sons and daughters. I'd rather the Spitalfield weavers should pull down all the houses in Old England and knock the brains out of all the wicked great men there, than this country should loose their liberty." In England, Lord Rockingham's secretary, Edmund Burke, who was also a member of Parliament and would later support the American Revolution, organized British merchants to contact their representatives in Parliament and essentially lobby for the Stamp Act to be repealed. Repeal also had the support of the aging William Pitt the Elder. Pitt believed that while the kingdom did have the right to govern and legislate over the colonies, it did not have the right to tax them, since taxes are, quote, "a voluntary gift and grant of the commons alone, and therefore can only be obtained through representation." Pitt went so far as to say, "I rejoice that America has resisted. 3 millions of people so dead to all the feelings of liberty as voluntarily to submit to be slaves would have been fit instruments to make slaves of the rest." Ultimately, however, it was not Pitt's constitutional arguments that made Parliament change its mind. It was the economic pressure from the merchants. By the time the new year rolled in, everything had come to a screeching halt. On January 1st, 1766, Adams confided to his diary, "This year brings ruin or salvation to the British colonies. The eyes of all America are fixed on the British Parliament. In short, Britain and America are staring at each other, and they will probably stare more and more for some time." Thankfully, the staring contest would only last for 1 month more, since even the most powerful will be forced to budge if their flow of revenue is disrupted. In February of 1766, Parliament met and heard testimony from several important individuals, including British merchants, regarding the boycotts and the Stamp Act, trying to figure out what the heck was going on. Are these American boycotts going to be a problem? Is it going to tank the economy? Is there a chance it might cause an even more revolutionary response? The most important witness in these hearings was our friend Benjamin Franklin. He was respected, loyal to the crown, had his finger on the pulse of the colonies, and was gaining a worldwide reputation as a brilliant scientist. On the last day of the hearings, during a testimony which lasted 4 hours, Franklin was asked whether the people of America would ever submit to the stamp tax under any circumstances. Franklin replied, "No, never, unless compelled by force of arms." Don't you think they would submit to the Stamp Act if it was modified, the obnoxious parts taken out, and the duty reduced to some particulars of small moment? No, they will never submit to it. Franklin explained, "The Stamp Act says we shall have no commerce, make no exchange of property with each other, neither purchase nor grant nor recover debts. We shall neither marry nor make our wills, unless we pay such and such sums, and thus it is intended to extort our money from us, or ruin us by the consequences of refusing to pay it." But supposing the external tax or duty to be laid on the necessaries of life imported into your colony, will not that be the same thing in its effects as an internal tax? I do not know a single article imported into the northern colonies, but what they can either do without or make themselves. Don't you think cloth from England absolutely necessary to them? No, by no means absolutely necessary. With industry and good management, they may very well supply themselves with all they want. Will it not take a long time to establish that manufacture among them? And must they not in the meanwhile suffer greatly? I think not. They have made a surprising progress already, and I am of opinion that before their old clothes are worn out, they will have new ones of their own making. The people will all spin and work for themselves in their own houses. If the act is not repealed, what do you think will be the consequences? A total loss of respect and affection the people of America bear to this country, and of all the commerce that depends on that respect and affection. How can the commerce be affected? You will find that if the act is not repealed, they will take a very little of your manufactures in a short time. Is it in their power to do without them? I think they may very well do without them. Would the people at Boston discontinue their trade? The merchants are very small in number compared with the body of the people, and must discontinue their trade if nobody will buy their goods. Well, what are the body of the people in the colonies? They are farmers, husbandmen, or planters. Historian Andrea Wolf argues that it was the colonial reliance on agriculture and farming which made them independent, and which allowed Franklin to so effectively threaten a boycott of British goods. She writes, "Almost all colonists lived off the land. Franklin believed that the colonists' reliance on agriculture for their main income, combined with the seemingly endless resources of the land, could be turned to their advantage. America could be self-sufficient." And as tension over the Stamp Act grew, Franklin argued that the colonies would be able to pressure the British by boycotting their goods. It was his 4-hour testimony in front of Parliament, many believed, that led to the repeal of the Stamp Act a few weeks later. Franklin's testimony owed its power not just to his quick wit, but to the self-sufficient lifestyles of the colonists, which gave gravity to his forebodings of continued boycotts. The colonies were not reliant on the British Empire. If Parliament didn't repeal the Stamp Act, they would go their own way, existing and thriving without it. If Parliament did repeal the Act, well then, things would go back to the way they had been, and everyone would be more or less happy. The important lesson here is that it wasn't rioting or even activism that ultimately led to the change. The civil unrest may have kept the Stamp Act from really going into effect, since colonial courts refused to convene and stamp distributors resigned out of fear for their well-being, but by itself it wasn't enough. It not only required the unified support of the colonial legislatures and the merchants, but it also required Franklin's level-headed mediation and a lifestyle of self-sufficiency in the colonies. Without Franklin's intervention, the civil disobedience and the boycotts may simply have led to a greater military presence and may ultimately have precipitated war, causing the Revolutionary War to happen 10 years earlier than it did. If you are an accelerationist, that might sound good. However, not only would such an acceleration have possibly led to a different outcome, with all of the modern revisionist efforts to reframe the American founders as being exclusively in the dimension of oppressors in the Marxist binary, it's easy to forget how fragile, vulnerable, and indeed powerless the young America was on the world stage, and how easily the war could have simply been another rebellion that was crushed rather than a revolution that was won. Furthermore, if you believe in American principles, you must believe in the kind of caution and moderation which characterized the American founding fathers, who were constantly looking to temper the excess of the mob with cautionary wisdom, to suppress riots and stamp out the violence of the rabble. As Franklin said before the House of Commons, every sober, sensible man would wish to see rioters punished, as otherwise peaceable people have no security of person or estate. From Franklin to MLK, the better path, no matter how frustrating, has been that of non-violence. Tact, acumen, breadth of knowledge, and the ability to speak powerfully. In a nation born young into the world, out of the words of some of the greatest men ever to live, it is logos that leads to change. Force, disciplined and organized, must be used only to resist force and coercion, which is used against us. But the thing that's even more important than the words of great men like Franklin was the self-sufficiency of the ordinary people, like the colonists. It was self-sufficiency that allowed the Americans to deny the British trade, and it's self-sufficiency that gave content to Franklin's threats. If the colonists had not been willing or able to live without the British, Franklin would have had nothing to say, and thankfully that wasn't the case. As Franklin said, colonial America was a place where industrious young couples could obtain their own land on which to raise a family, and manufacturing what they must in order to provide for their own basic needs. America could be independent because Americans lived independent lifestyles. Modern people who are not self-sufficient, who can't make their own clothes or grow their own food, who don't live in communities with friends and true neighbors who can cooperate to provide these things, such modern people can't boycott grocery stores or corporations or governments, and therefore they cannot be truly independent. To the degree that you need other people, to that degree, you are capable of being a slave. To echo John Adams in the final installment of his dissertation, ignorance, extreme poverty, and dependence are political slavery. The other important lesson here is that while self-sufficiency comes from many places, it comes most fundamentally from the earth, the land, agriculture, gardening, and farming. As we will see going forward, the Revolutionary War itself was grounded literally and firmly in an agrarian economy and a very specific, self-sufficient lifestyle of its people. Sometimes when politics and legislation fails, free people have to defend themselves, as we'll see in the next video. When worst does come to worst, you cannot revolt or declare your independence without self-sufficiency. And you cannot have that without the garden. Well, if you're still watching, thank you so much. I have tons of respect for you. Hopefully that means I made a good video that was entertaining to watch. And it almost definitely means that you have a hunger for minute, esoteric, specific knowledge of the past from original sources. This is definitely not a video I expect to be popular. It's not the kind that makes you successful on YouTube or that a lot of people care about or have the patience for. And it's not by any means perfect. But I thought it was important, and I wanted to go ahead and get it out there, in part because I do think it's important for our moments, and because I think John Adams is right about knowledge, and I want to get this particular knowledge out there. It's not enough to have punditry and opinions. In fact, the less of those things we have, the better. Instead, we need knowledge and we need sources and principles. The futures of our countries, our homes, and our lives is absolutely determined by what books we have on our shelves, and more importantly, what books we have in us, in our minds, etched into our psyches. But since the reality is that not everyone is going to read these old original sources, and not everyone who does read them is going to know what to do with them, I wanted to at least make as much of this knowledge as accessible as I can, hopefully in a form that is relatively interesting. I hope this video was helpful to you. I hope it might inspire some further education or some plans for next year's garden. Who knows? I have promised that my next videos are going to be short because making videos this long is just absolutely sucks the life out of me. But who knows? I might break that promise immediately. We'll see. We'll see. The next few videos should probably be on Kubrick. And it's hard not to talk a long time about Kubrick. But we'll see. I'll say it again if you're still watching. Thank you so much. And by way of announcement, I'll say that my first video on Patreon should be up now. And so if you're interested in that, feel free to check it out. Either way, thanks for watching. See you next time.